All right, welcome everybody. My name's Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artist Network. It's Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern, and we're drawing together. So I want to welcome everybody. A little out of it at the moment. I just walked in the door about 20 minutes ago from having a root canal. So, if I look a little droopy, that's what's causing that. I feel all right otherwise, but I want to thank you all for joining me. This is what we're working on today, this portrait of this girl. So again, practicing portrait drawing, this has been somewhat of a nemesis for me, but you know, as we know, the show is all about us taking time out of our busy lives to draw and improve our skills. And this is one area that I'm looking to improve. And I feel like I've gotten better over the last year and a half of this show. So, and you all have helped me tremendously get there. And now, so if you're new, you're going to want to know that this show is all about us drawing together. So if you want to follow along with this reference image, you can find that in the description below. There's a link to it. There is also a link in the description as well as pinned to the top of the chat where you can share your work when you're done. So this video goes up as a recording after the live event, so feel free to ask any questions, share your observations, your thoughts on drawing and art making in general, and we as a community will do our best to help move that conversation along. And as always, you know, feel free to call out any sort of observations you have about my own work. So, you know, if you notice something that seems a little bit off or have an alternate suggestion on how I might approach something, I love to hear it. So everything's on the table if you want to share any thoughts about drawing. Welcome, oh, Heather, welcome back. It has been a while. So it's good to see you back in the chat. It's good to see all these familiar names: Jackie, Ursula, Pat, Liz, Cindy, Brenda, everybody. Oh, did my camera just freeze? Darn it. I've been having trouble with this camera. It seems to, there we go. It looks like we're back. I keep trying to find new solutions for this camera that's facing me right now, and it's done nothing but give me trouble. So I apologize for that. Hopefully it was running smooth earlier when I was giving it a test, but all right. Let's get to it. What am I working with today? Materials. This is the preparatory sketch I did. I did this in a large sketchbook, so it's a slightly different format. This is the Rives BFK rag paper that Legion provides. I love this stuff. I love rag papers to draw on. So I'm going to try that out today. My trusty erasers, I've got my kneaded eraser as well as my retractable rubber eraser that I love, and of course it's shaved down into this chisel tip so that I have a variety of surfaces and sharp points that I can draw with. My trusty blending stump, I'm going to be using that a bunch today, and I'm working with the Cezanne Graphite Pencils today. So what do I have? I've got the HB and the B, and then an 8B, and this was just kind of a last minute grab for me. So I just kind of like, well, these ones look good. And you know, the HB and the B are very similar to one another, but I kind of have two of them because I'll be doing a bulk of the drawing using those two. And so I can kind of interchange them and have one that is perhaps sharper than another. And then my 8B is my soft graphite one. Now this, I want to kind of talk a little bit about kind of deviating from the photograph a bit. You know, of course, we can see in this reference photo, this one that's below me here, there's that other figure behind the primary subject here. And I chose to leave that out for this drawing. And I also chose to kind of play with just the value range and the atmosphere and edges on this, and again, deviating a bit from the reference. And so I'll see where I go today. I'm going to try to let the drawing lead the process today. That's kind of, I guess, what I'm saying in this is I'm going to start making marks, trying to work out the correct proportions, and then see what's happening on the page that I'm responding to, either positively or negatively, and let that drive the direction I take this. So, like, again, a lot of it has to do with the background. I kind of adjusted the lighting a little bit. You know, it's a bit more higher contrast than the reference photo than what I have here. But just as I was building this, I liked the atmospheric effects that were developing and the idea that these soft marks here can create a sense of depth and volume in the figure. So that's what was kind of leading those decisions, and also increasing the contrast in these primary features to help really pull the viewer in that way. I may take a different approach today. That's why we're doing this. Let's see. Okay, Cindy, thank you. If you see drool coming down, just, I don't know, it'll be fun. We'll go with it. Hello from Honolulu, welcome. I see some new names here if you are new. I love to see where you are all viewing from. And again, I apologize if I'm a bit slurred today. I typically don't run these live sessions having just visited the dentist, and I hope this will be the last time. But it was one of those emergency situations where I had to get in. This is the only time available. I gotta move this out of the way. All right. I'm working on a slightly larger paper today as well. So I normally work on like a 9 by 11-ish size. This is a 10 by 12 and a half, somewhere around there. A little bit larger because I wanted a little bit more room to maneuver with the portrait. So as we've talked about before, one of the nice things about the whole drawing process is that it helps to connect us with our minds a little bit. It brings our mind and body together, taking us out of kind of everything that else that is going around in our lives, bringing us into this moment here where we're drawing. And I kind of need that today. I just need to get my arm moving and start making marks on the page to bring me into focus. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about right now, loosening up, using the side of the pencil in this overhand grip. And I figure, well, since I'm just making some of these abstract marks and just loosening up, I might as well have some of these marks start to in some way reference the subject. And as a result, what you have developing now is a loose gesture. Now, you can see though that I'm not starting the gesture by rendering the features. I'm not drawing an eye, I'm not drawing a nose, etc. I'm looking for the abstract shapes of light and dark. And I'm trying to think just broadly about how this subject is going to fit on the surface. This is all getting in the way, so I'm going to move this. Hello everybody. We got people from Connecticut, LA, Indianapolis, Cleveland, Niagara Falls, beautiful up there. That's awesome. Yeah, we have people that view from all over the world, which makes this awesome. And again, if you're new, this is all about us kind of getting together to draw together. I like to talk through the stuff that I'm doing in hopes that it's helpful to anybody who's looking to improve their skills. But my intention here is to not create an instructor-student relationship. I don't see myself as the instructor. I like it when we have artists that just get together and draw. That's when cool things happen, especially when we can provide alternate observations about our work. Now, I don't have the ability to see your work, but if you're able to describe what's happening on your page, that's awesome, as well as if you're able to share it on artistnetwork.com when you're done on the show page. That can be, it's a lot of fun to view that. So as you can see, I'm building up these layers. I'm looking for these simple shapes at this point. Now, this isn't always the way I start a portrait. I'm just kind of trying this out today because that's what feels good in the moment. And sometimes that's what happens in art making, is we try approaching things differently depending on how we feel in that moment. And so what I'm trying to do is, it may not look like it, but or you can't really tell by what's happening here, but I'm looking at the subject through a soft focus. I'm letting everything fall out of focus because I just want to see it as an abstract arrangement of light and dark shapes. And then out of this arrangement of light and dark shapes, we're going to find a degree of refinement based on the tools that we use to better understand the subject. So we're going to use the drawing process to better understand the subject, and the more we understand the subject, the better the drawing will turn out, the more accurate, I should say. There's a lot of kind of craziness happening down in this area. When it's out of focus, all I see is this general light area with all these kind of interesting shapes. And when I bring it into focus, I can see that there's a hand back behind her ear, and then it merges with her ear. And so as an abstract form, it becomes really kind of confusing. And that's one of the benefits for when kind of squinting your eyes or blurring your focus. By trying to see them as shapes, you're disassociating yourself from your labeling of the object and your preconceived notions about what the object is and how it should be drawn. And that can be really, it can be really valuable sometimes to consider, like, what are we bringing to the drawing, right? What types of processes or kind of understanding of the forms are we projecting onto the drawing and onto the subject, versus what is the subject telling us. So in some way, there's part of my brain that enjoys the idea that I'm almost drawing for the first time, and I'm encountering the subject for the first time, and trying to shed the previous knowledge I've had about how to draw something and try to come at it with a fresh perspective. It's not entirely possible, but as best I can. There's a little dent right here in the paper that's creating this shadow that I just kind of noticing, but I'm going to try to address. All right. So as you can see, I've started to kind of build up a little kind of reserve of graphite on my hand as I wipe this down. Again, I'm just trying to build up tone on the page. I'm not worried about preserving any of the white of the page because I'm going to use my eraser to pull out some of the highlights later. And by wiping things down, it helps to unify the marks, and you can start to build up a smooth tone. I know for myself, when I was starting out in the drawing process, I would kind of labor over creating smooth gradations of value or even spans of tone. And what I learned is that it becomes most effective when I build it up as a lot of light layers, and each of those layers can be fairly rough and uncontrolled, but when you blend them together, they'll average out into a nice even tone. All right, Tammy, portraits are not us, but giving it a try. That's awesome. That is the drawing together spirit. Portland, Oregon, welcome. In Baytown, Texas. Scott lived there. All right. Houston, awesome. Very cool. If you are new, I'd love to hear kind of what your motivations are as artists. What brought you here? How did you find us? What are you looking for? What are your hopes and aspirations? I know for myself, this show started because when we all found ourselves being less able to move about freely in the world, it was a good opportunity for me to focus on drawing, and I had found that as a plein air painter, I had neglected that part of my practice, and so this is an opportunity for me to sharpen my drawing skills, and in particular, the drawing skills, what it provides me is a greater degree of accuracy when I'm painting from life out in the field. I can get to a more accurate depiction of the proportions more quickly through practicing drawing. So that's what it is for me. I know for some of you watching, drawing is your primary media, which is cool. Some of you are just looking to kill some time during the week. Some of you are farther along in your career as artists, so we get people from all different stages. All right. So the general flow that I like to think about for my drawings is to start with a gesture and then move into refining the proportions, and then refining edges. Those are three kind of main phases. A final fourth phase might be layering on detail or greater refinement. Now, we all kind of approach gesture drawing a little bit differently. In this case, I'm approaching it by exploring abstract shapes of light and dark, like I was saying earlier. Some of you might be starting this by drawing an oval to represent the basic form of the head, starting to establish an axis for the eye, an axis for the nose, into the mouth, and build from that method. There are a lot of kind of books and instructional videos and a lot of great artists that work that way. And I'm kind of coming at it a little bit differently today, and that's really just a kind of last minute choice that I'm making. But I was just gonna want to put that out there, that if you're initiating your drawing in a different manner, there's nothing wrong with that. We all kind of choose a different way, and I might have chosen a different way today just based on how I was feeling. What I'm looking for, though, I think the approach that I'm going to take is to try to, again, start with these abstract shapes and then start by creating a sense of volume and then find the features within that. I'm looking for something that is kind of unified in that way. And it looks like my camera froze up. Hopefully you can still hear me talking. All right, what is happening? This is really frustrating. There, looks like we're back. I don't know what's going on with my program, but I've been trying different programs to tie in my webcam here, and everyone seems to be a little janky at the moment. All right, but okay, so to kind of get back at to what I was talking about, I'm trying to start from a point of volume, of light and shadow, and then find the form within that. And so some of those tools that you might be familiar with if you've studied with other artists or looked at other books or trained in other places, again, might be to start by establishing an axis for the eyes, an axis for the central axis here, but splitting the eye and the nose, measuring down from the nose to the mouth. And what I find myself doing is with increasing frequency, starting portrait drawings this way. Because what I would find is that when I would start by mapping out the features first and then applying shading on top, that initial map would often feel correct when it was linear. And then once I created a sense of volume out of that, I would realize that none of it feels right. It doesn't. The proportions are actually off. I kind of interpret the forms of things differently when they're rendered through line versus value or form. And that's where I'm going with this. Right now I'm kind of staying in this central area, starting to visualize just these abstract shapes in here that I know, and I'm trying to cognitively kind of override that part of my brain that is defining this as eyes and a nose. I'm doing my best to try to stay in the abstract here. Still using an overhand grip so that I use the side of the pencil, which encourages broad areas of value rather than lines. And then we're going to go through and start to adjust the proportions later on. And what can be helpful in this is that I'm essentially getting myself in the ballpark with some of these proportions. And then I'm going to be gradually correcting and adjusting them. But hopefully this all makes sense. And again, if you have an alternate approach, tell us what you are doing. how your drawing is coming along, what works for you, what doesn't. And I'm trying to move all throughout the drawing. Try not to get fixated in one area too much, because that, from my past experience, has been a recipe for disaster when I focus on one area at a time, because our understanding of the form gets skewed. The more we look at something, the more distorted it actually gets. So I feel like I become a more objective observer when I'm taking a lot of quick glances versus one long glance there. All right, from South Africa, welcome. Only painted and drawn wildlife, so Claudia, welcome. And you've been asked to do a child's portrait, so you need instruction and practice on that. That's awesome. So we do have quite a few other portrait sessions in this series that you might be able to find in the playlist. And I've taken different approaches to them. And one of them, I think the last time I did a portrait, it was Britain, that's right. We used the DaVinci Eye app to help kind of move things along a little bit more quickly in terms of those proportions. So that might be an interesting one to check out. I'm a fan of trying out any and all tools to see what it reveals about the art making process. But we are going to get into kind of basic proportions. I'm going to talk through the measurements that I make. Right now I'm kind of just setting the stage, and that I'm kind of putting it out there because what I found is that, you know, a lot of portrait artists, there's a commonality in the proportions that they make, the approach that you're taking to proportions, but there's also kind of interesting nuances in the differences, the things that each portrait artist might look at. And so, again, that's an opportunity if you want to share your approach to that. Let's see. Again, I'll be kind of getting into that. I'm just setting the stage right now, but I'm kind of getting closer to the point where I want to start to map out those proportions. What I'm looking at right now, I'm going to step away from the portrait a little bit in my mind and just think about the abstract arrangement of light and darks. Now, I'm saying that, I've said that multiple times because it's a big thing for me that I keep forgetting. I get so sucked into the subject that sometimes I forget to think about just the design of a drawing or a painting, and does it feel like a pleasing arrangement? And it can be sometimes frustrating because that can feel so subjective, and sometimes I just want an objective truth to be laid out for me. But so what I'm looking at is just, again, this mass of dark, this mass of light, and then what would happen if I were to balance that with just some dark mass in this area. So then now I have a contrast between dark to light, light to dark, and dark to light. So I'm looking for that sequence there. And then throughout this process, I'll just be gradually refining edges and sharpening and allowing some of these soft edges to remain. And what I'm finding is I kind of did a light indication of the mouth earlier that has now just become more distraction than anything. So I'm going to take that out. Kind of go back to that. Okay. Mariana Wood found these shows by happy accident over a year ago. Awesome, welcome, a whole year. There's a lot of you that have been with us for over a year, so that's very cool. I'm glad you've learned so much. Yeah, Ellen Ramirez is saying, our eyes see in light and shadow patterns, so I understand why you're approaching it that way. Yeah, that's very well said. I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, we definitely do that, and I totally align with that. You know, our brains are amazing things that can look at abstract shapes and make sense out of them, right? And so sometimes I feel like, you know, all we have to do as artists is to provide a little bit of spark on the page for the brain to latch onto. And I think for a long time, I had the mentality that I had to be overly explicit with what I gave to the viewer in terms of information, just greater and greater amounts of information. But now I'm kind of in the mind of exploring how little can I actually provide. Oh, Danny's saying, okay, you caught me. I started a few with the few movements of the oval and then changed direction. Awesome. Oh, so Heather is saying, which portrait lesson was that with the Da Vinci Eye app? So that was a boy's portrait. Yeah, I think I just titled it Boy's Portrait. So if you go to the Artist Network Drawing Together page, you'll find it there. It would have been within the last 10 or so episodes. I think we're on episode 112 or 113. So I think it's after we did episode 100. So it's somewhere in there. I'm sorry. But Zephy, welcome. Kente, a long-time subscriber, first-time participator. Well, I'm glad you're participating. That's awesome. Tinkerer's wife, in the classes I took years ago, the instructors didn't go through the practice of using shapes, just the lines on the face to determine where things fit. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Yeah, and I have to admit that with my years as an instructor, I would often teach those proportions. And I've kind of pivoted a little bit because I think the proportions are important to understand. But it can make a big difference when you introduce that into your process. We as artists will kind of have our own way of fitting all of these different things in. We talk about shading and proportions, line work, form, volume, texture. Those are all important elements in a drawing. But we as artists have control over where we push and pull each of those things. When do we introduce it? When do we hold back? And so proportions are important for portrait work, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to lead with the proportions. Sometimes it works great, sometimes it doesn't. All right, so now that I have this basic kind of ghostly shape established here, and I can start to see there's a figure emerging, I want to make this a more specific figure. One thing I'm worried about doing is running off the top of the page too much. So I'm going to kind of give myself a rough indicator of the top of the head, and I want to place the chin. Now I've started to indicate the eyes. So we talk about this in the show. I get a little distracted sometimes. But what happens is my goal is to figure out where to put the chin. When I get there, I realize I don't quite have enough information to get me there, so I need to find more information. The next piece of information might be where is the axis for the eyes, right? And so again, my goal is to place the chin, but I have to kind of take a circuitous route to get there. So I'm gonna drop this line here. Now I'm going to use comparative measuring to figure out a rough placement of where that chin is. So what that is if you're new to that, I'm actually going to bring up a larger scale image. I have your chat over here, and I have the big image right here. And what I'm looking at in front of me is that overhead projection that you're looking at. So I can see it as though it's flat and in front of me, and that helps me to adjust the proportions. Now this large image here is going to be my reference, and if you have an actual subject, a live subject in front of you, use all of these same tools, and you're going to find that you're going to grow a lot faster when you work from a live model. But working from a photograph can also teach you a lot about the drawing process. So don't ever hesitate to draw thinking that it's only best and you should only draw from a live model. Like I said, I think it's best if you do, but don't let that hold you back. Reference image those over here. Now I'm closing one eye so that flattens my depth perception. And so when I have this pencil in front of me, it feels like it's directly on top of the reference. I'm aligning this with the top of her head on the reference. And I'm sliding my finger, and actually I'll use my thumb. I'm going to slide down to generally where the axis of the eye is. And that gives me a measurement. And then I can slide it down and then place the top of this along that axis for the eye. So I can compare that distance from the top of the head to the axis of the eye to the axis of the eye down to the chin. And what I notice is then if this becomes my unit that I'm measuring here, and I bring this down, the bottom of the chin is just below that distance. So she's got a slight tilt to her head, so that's pushing the eyes up a little bit, right? So if I go like this, you can see that this distance is shorter than this. If I go like this, it flips. So now the distance from my eyes to the top of the head is greater than from the eyes to the chin. And if you're looking straight on, they're generally equidistant. The eyes are generally in the middle of the head. So she's got the slight upturn, so that pushes that axis up a little bit. And so some of those initial marks that I was making were pretty accurate. Now, it brings to mind one of the reasons I chose to start by building up some tone on the paper is that it makes some of these measurement marks a little bit more gentle on the surface. I can move them around a little bit more freely. When I go right to the white paper, it can feel a little harsh, and it kind of throws me off. And so building up that tone on the surface is a great way to loosen up, but it also it prepares the surface of the paper a little bit more, so that I find it a little bit easier to work with some of those measurement marks. Let's see, and if, well, Patricia, welcome, your first time here. You've been drawing and painting for decades, but not recently, so I'm glad you're getting back into it. And then Titus is saying, what are the first parts you start with when you're drawing a portrait? So as I was saying earlier, what I'm starting with is trying to capture the overall shape of the head. I don't do that all the time. Sometimes I'll start with the eyes and move out. Sometimes I'll start from the outer side of the edge of the head and then move my way in. I change it up, and I do that kind of intentionally because I have a hard time sticking with the pattern. And I learned something new that way. So hopefully, again, that's where I'm at. Today I'm starting with the basic light and shadow shapes, but that's not how I always start. All right, welcome from Edmonton, Susan. Okay, so I'm taking this measurement. Okay, so now I have a rough indicator of that mark there. Now I'm intentionally making a fairly broad mark. We can make those a bit more specific later. I don't want a hard, sharp line. One, because it's harder to erase later, and then two, because it adds a level of precision that I'm not quite ready for yet. All right, I'm getting closer. I'm not being accurate at this point. I haven't sat with the subject long enough to make accurate calculations about those proportions, and I don't want my drawing to reflect that. I don't want my drawing to be precise when my observations are not. All right, so I'm lightly indicating the central axis. And I think what I'm going to do is measure down to the nose, but I need to figure out where on the nose. I think I'm going to measure to the tip of the nose, not to the bottom of the nostril. But again, sometimes it's helpful to be clear about when you're making a measurement, where precisely are you measuring on a feature. Like the corners of the eye are nice, clean landmarks, but the nose has many different landmarks that you could choose, and the same with the mouth. So, all right, so if I take, here's what I'll do. So my goal is to place place the nose, but I need more information. All right, so what I'm observing, if this becomes my central axis, I can place the corners of the eyes, the inside corners of the eyes, and that creates a measurement. Based on this observation, that distance between those inner corner of the eyes is equivalent to the distance from that eye axis to the tip of the nose. So then the tip of the nose would be somewhere right around here. Now, I just guessed that spacing. Now I need to double check that. I need to compare that to other kind of known proportions, and really the only known proportion I have is this distance from the eye axis to the top of the head. So let me take the distance between the eyes and compare that to the distance between the eye axis and the top of the head. So 1, 2, it's about 2 3/4. So if I go like this, if I take this measurement, turn it on its side, I get 1, 2, and a little bit more. So I'm pretty close. Let me double check that again. 1, 2, and that's about 3. Am I measuring correctly? I'm doing this multiple times because I screw this up all the time. Things are a little squishy. Oh, wrong here. So I need to measure the distance between the eyes from the eye axis up. Am I placing that correctly? I'm kind of having a hard time seeing up over my hand here, so I need to use the camera view to... I think I'm actually in pretty good shape. At least I'm close enough to move forward, and I might adjust slightly as I go along. So I'm kind of putting that out there that, you know, I'm making these measurements, but they're within the context of me being clear that they could be off. And then I'm going to compare the distance between the eyes to the width of each eye. So if I take that measurement again, and what I notice is that the distance between the eyes is slightly greater than the width of each eye from corner to corner. So if I take that measurement right here, measure across, then now I have these parameters in which the eyes will fit. And I know that the outer corner of the eye is going to be just set in from there. And then giving myself a little bit of information here. Just so that I remember those proportions a little bit easier. Now, one of the things that I would often instruct students with when I was teaching was I would offer the suggestion to render the eyes last. Because I know for myself at least, every part of me wants to get in there and draw those eyes like perfectly and beautifully, because that's so satisfying. What I've learned about myself though is that when I do that, I often lose steam, and then the rest of the drawing just becomes flat. So I'm going to hold off on that and use that anticipation throughout the drawing process, because I'm like, I can't get to the eyes until I get the rest, so let me move on. So oh, thank you, Carolyn, for pointing out which episode the boy's portrait was. Yeah, I've been experimenting with some of these apps. So there's the DaVinci Eye app, as well as the Camera Lucida app that I've been kind of working with. So I'm working on kind of a road test of that, and that'll be posted on Artist Network soon. Really interesting. I think some of these tools that we have available to us can teach us a lot about how we observe the world and how we fit those observations into our drawing practice. And of course, they can also be very helpful in managing proportions. But I was kind of taking the approach of how does it fit into our drawing practice. Okay, so central axis, tip of the nose. Now I'm going to measure down from the tip of the nose to that center of her mouth. So I'm going to take that measurement, and I'm going to try to compare that to, holy smokes, I compared it to the width between the eyes, and they're the same. That is a happy coincidence. It's not always the case. So if I take the distance between the eyes, again, measure down from the tip of the nose, that distance should place me generally the center of the mouth. And now I'm going to compare that to the distance between the mouth and the chin. Oh, and then here's another cool thing that lines up. Width of the eye, that's my base unit now. If I measure up from the chin, that indicates that bottom ridge of her lower lip. So then it starts to give me some greater proportions to work with. So now the way I try to think about establishing proportions is that I'm trying to create increasingly smaller regions to work within. So we're starting with this whole sheet of paper, and we need to divide it and divide it and divide it. We're constantly subdividing these larger forms so that in a way that creates a unified whole, right? And so we start with a large piece of paper, starting with major proportions. Now we're making smaller ones, and then within that, I can be a little bit more free to explore greater detail and precision with these marks, because I know that all I have to do is stay within that region and I should be okay. And I know it's going to fit with other parts of the drawing. So hopefully that makes sense. If you are just joining us, I know we have new people that kind of pop in all the time. I want to welcome you. My name is Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artists Network. And we meet every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. And it almost didn't happen today because of that root canal that just happened. But I'm like, all right, well, you guys are a good audience and you're good sports, and you'll be okay if I show up and I'm kind of drooling out of one side. I notice right now I've bitten my tongue a few times while talking, so I'm trying to be careful about that. All right, other proportions. So generally the width of the nose fits between the eyes, right? So if we set that as a base unit, then we can compare. Everybody's different. Some people are going to have wider noses, some are going to have narrower. Hers are just slightly wider than the distance between the eyes. And now I'm intentionally not using lines to create these forms. And again, my priority right now is on volume and light. And I'm going to be finding sharper edges. If I create a hard line to define an edge, then that may be something that I end up fighting against later on. It may work against me. So I'm kind of sneaking up on these forms, looking at subtle relationships between light and dark. So if I look at that nose, for example, there's the broad statement that we can make that we have a light side and shadow side. And then we can look more closely and realize that within the shadow side, we have reflected light, we have darker, deeper shadow cores, things like that. And then within the light side, we have variations there as well. So it can be helpful to kind of keep that in mind, that that when you're try to keep your values organized. I guess this is what I'm trying to spit out there, is when I'm on the light side, trying to keep my marks lighter. When I'm in the shadow side, I can go a little bit darker. And when I talked earlier about the benefit of thinking in terms of abstract shapes, with a shape like the nose, it can be really helpful to continue that. So right now, I'm trying to think, right here, there's this kind of triangular shape, and it merges with this rectangular shadow shape. There's a specific angle here, and it changes pitch. And those are the types I'm thinking about, the types of things I'm thinking about. I'm not thinking, oh, how do I draw a nostril, right, or draw the tip of a nose, because I'm not quite ready for that. That comes in at the very end, after I've given myself a little bit more information and I've taken more time to sit with the subject. Oh, Diane B13. My mistake was looking at the bag under the eye. That is a really good observation. The eyes are such tricky things. Now, we're fighting biology a little bit when we're drawing portraits, because our brains are designed to recognize very subtle shifts in a person's expression. We're really good at recognizing individuals. I mean, there's a lot of diversity in the human population, but there's also a lot of commonality, and we're really good at seeing the very little things that define one person from another, or one expression from another. And as a result, that can be something that works against us when we're drawing. because we become so finely tuned to those little things that starts to dominate the drawing process, and we often haven't properly set the stage and created the proper form and volume of the figure or the portrait. And so the bags under the eyes, that's something that throws me off too, because often those are more visible. I notice that in myself. Photos of myself, I'll often see like these dark lines under here. Those are more visible than the lower eyelid, the lower edge of that lower eyelid. So, hello all, Rob CP Woodturner, welcome. I don't know if you're new, but I don't recognize that name, so if you're new, welcome. Okay, back to this. I'm a little scattered right now, so I need to clarify my plan a little bit. Just indicating, I think, that upper lip. Now, the other thing about drawing facial features is that we often have a tendency to outline, create contour lines, and make them sharper, harder than they actually are. And so what I'm trying to do right now is when I'm looking at the subjects, or the features, I'm sorry, when I'm looking at the features, I'm looking at them specifically to observe the soft areas, right? Because I know when I look with sharp focus, I will tend to over-render something, right? So if I'm looking down in here, what I'm looking for is the overall shadow shape. So there's the form shadow, the shadow that's on the form of the object. You have the light side, the shadow side. That form shadow is the shadow that's on the form. And then you have a cast shadow. So an object will cast a shadow when there's a strong light source. If you look at the nose is both. It is a form shadow right here, and it's casting a shadow on the cheek. And it's hard to really distinguish the two. They really merge together. So what I'm trying to do is find that one shape, and squinting the eyes helps to do that. And so what I'm looking for is the shape of the shadow that crosses over all of the features. Rather than drawing the features first and then shading on top of them, I'm flipping that process. And I'm doing that because I want to create a more unified portrait. And if I start by outlining the forms, I'm starting from a position of division on the page rather than a position of unification, if that makes sense. So, so if you look here, for example, that lower lip, you know what the way the light is often coming from above. So what that means is with that upper lip, it's undercut generally, so it gets a little bit more shaded. Lower lip protrudes, catching the light more, but because of that protrusion, it casts a shadow underneath it. So we get generally an alternating sequence in the lips of dark, light, and then dark. And so we're looking for those proportions. As I come down here, I'm going to start to place that dark mask that represents the corner of her mouth. I'm going to do a quick check-in though where I am relative to the nostril and the eye. So the eye can be a good kind of anchor from which you measure and place the corner of the mouth. Now, one of the cool things about portrait drawing and recognizing portraits is that the way our brains work is that we tend to have kind of an average human in our mind, right? And so that when we encounter somebody else, we're more primed to see the difference, how that person deviates from the average, right? And that's developed as an efficiency within our brain because, you know, we're processing less information. If we're already starting, we already have a foundation built in our head. All we have to do is quickly process how that person deviates from that whole thing. We don't have to reconstruct the human face from scratch every time we look at somebody. And, you know, caricature artists leverage that part of the brain to create dynamic portraits by really kind of locking in on the features that can deviate from that average construction that we've built in our minds. And so some of these proportions, it can be helpful to kind of measure, to understand kind of general proportions, and then really try to figure out, well, how does this person, if we're going to capture this likeness, how does this person deviate from that average? And I feel like I'm feeling pretty confident in the overall proportion so far. Again, I'm kind of working from the center out. And that has become a bit of a default for me because over years of doing it the other way, by drawing an oval first and then working inward, I always made the oval too wide. That was just my bias. I always made it too wide, and I had to then correct it, and I'm like, oh man, everything now has to change because I built everything from a flawed foundation. So then when I flipped it and I started working from the center outward, then at least I got that relationship more correct, and I could then build the shape of the head around that more effectively. So I'm just kind of, again, throwing that out there. That's what's worked for me, but what's exciting is that it may be different for each of you. Okay, I'm applying a little bit of angle sighting here to help find the shape of the jawline and the shape of the head. So if you're new to that term, then what you're doing with angle sighting is similar to comparative measuring. Closing one eye so you're flattening your depth perception so you can use your pencil as a guide and it appears to be directly on top of your subject. I'm finding the angle of this part of the jaw and just the average angle, not, I'm trying to find that span right there. What is that average angle? Lock my wrist, carry it, place it on directly on top of the drawing. In this case, I have that projection in front of me. I'm placing it directly on the kind of the vertical projection there. I'm going to find the other angle here, and then I'm kind of dropping in these average angles, and then from there, again, I can subdivide that and make that even more specific. Now, the other tool that can be really helpful, I haven't talked about that yet, but we talk about it a lot in the show, is practicing the art of the indirect gaze. So when I'm looking at the reference image, the small one that's in front of me, I can see the drawing building just to the right. So I'm going to focus on the reference, but I'm going to put some awareness on what's happening in the drawing. I can see movement happening in my periphery. And that helps me to evaluate the angles that I'm working with. And I've often found that the indirect gaze is more accurate in many ways. It's often more accurate in terms of perceiving subtle variations, shifts in value. Now I'm gonna kind of get back in here and kind of round out some of these forms. I'm going to soften this edge because in the reference I don't have a lot of information, but where that edge gets really defined is with that earlobe that protrudes, that intersects with the jawline. And so what I want to do is a quick check-in to see where, if I were to draw a horizontal guide, where would that intersect with the ear? So right about there. Again, keeping the marks fairly light and loose. I'm still using this overhand grip because I don't want to be creating lines at this point. The lines will come in later. Oops, that was a heavier mark than I intended. And the ears are tricky. I'll get to that a little bit later. I'm just going to rough them in, but we'll talk about some of those basic portions a little bit. Now, one of the indicators that her head is tilted back a little bit is the placement of the ears. So the ears generally fall within the distance between your eyes and your nose, or on that same kind of track. So again, if I tilt my head up, that drops the ears down from your point of view. If I tilt my head down, that raises them up. So the relationship between the ears and the eyes helps to indicate the tilt of the head. And that's particularly relevant because if you're trying to capture those subtle tilts and shifts of the head, and you get the placement of the ears wrong, the viewer will notice that and say something's a little bit off here, and it's going to throw off our interpretation of the proportions as a whole. So that, in my mind, the placement of the ears becomes a particularly important thing to factor into your drawing. I'm going to come across here, and now that her ear here is all in shadow, I'm going to build up more of a shadow shape here. How are we doing? We're about an hour in. We're moving along okay. Now, I could just go right across and try to place the left and the right ears at the same horizontal axis, but I don't know if that's really the case. Where as humans, we have all sorts of, kind of unique asynchronicities or asymmetries. So I'm trying to find that angle. And there's actually a slight downward angle here so that this ear is a little bit lower. So she's got an interesting tilt to her head. Let me evaluate that actually. Now this eye I think needs to come down a little bit. And I didn't notice that at first. I might need to reinforce that a little bit. That's one of the things that at least I know about my mind, is that I have a tendency to seek symmetry and a horizontal plane, an even spacing of things. And so when I'm looking at a subject, when I'm looking at her, my initial assumption is that her eyes are at a perfectly horizontal axis, when in fact there's a slight decline from left to right. Yeah. All right, and then that as a result, it affects the placement of this ear over here. All these little things, it can feel overwhelming sometimes to try to keep track of all the little things to be aware of when drawing a portrait. But you'll get there. If you're just starting out, hopefully you're being kind to yourself and being patient. I know I had opportunities when I was starting out to be kinder to myself, and I had to learn that. I'd be a little harsh. Have higher expectations, but I hadn't really realized the benefit of patience when I was younger. And then just the kind of the trust that with practice you'll get there. So as I'm trying to map out her neck here, and you can see I'm kind of moving back and forth. I'm building up some value here, but when I'm looking at the reference, I'm also trying to figure out where is it precisely that the neck intersects with the jawline. Indicate a little bit of the neck tendons there. Oh, if for those of you who attended the art party as part of the celebration for our 100th episode, one of the guest artists was Brent Eviston. He's a friend and another. I think he's another drawing instructor. I think he's a great one. He has this Art and Science of Drawing series you can find on Artist Network. His new book is out, so if anybody's looking for an instructional book on drawing, check out his book, The Art and Science of Drawing. I was very impressed by how robust it is. It really covers a lot of ground. All right. There's a question about where did I find the portrait. So in the description below, I have the photo credited. So it's either on Pixabay or Unsplash, or the two sites that I go for. When I'm not taking my own reference photos, then I find them on some of these other sites for royalty-free photography, and I think I accredited the photographer there. If I didn't, I deeply apologize, and I will update that as soon as the live stream is over. But all right, so what am I doing now? Trying to get my head back in the game. I suppose that pun was intended as we're drawing a portrait. Now that the portrait is starting to emerge, there's a likeness, and we've talked about this before, but there's for criminy sake, there's a frozen camera. See if I can fix it. And it seems to fix it. I just need to reselect it as an input. But there's a point in the drawing process that I really dig, and that's when looking at the page, it shifts from a two-dimensional surface, marks on a two-dimensional surface, to now something that's three-dimensional. And as I'm making these marks on the page, I'm thinking that I'm wrapping around, looking at the distance between the nose and the ear, or at the way the forehead kind of rolls back into space there. And that's one of the reasons why I'm with increasing frequency starting my drawings this way of building up these larger masses, because it gets me to that point of three-dimensional form more quickly. And once I'm in that space, it affects how I interpret those proportions. Generally for the better, sometimes not, but generally I interpret the proportions of things more accurately when I see them as three-dimensional forms. And so I try to get to that more quickly. Leaving these proportion marks on there right now, they're starting to become a distraction, but I'm going to leave them on there because I'm not quite ready to kind of lock in the proportions. I'm going to switch to this 8B. It's going to go a little bit darker because I want to, especially in the eyes, I want to draw a little bit more focus. So keeping my eyes soft and out of focus here when I'm studying and kind of moving my eyes back and forth between the drawing and the reference to see what stands out. And one of the things I'm trying to now observe is her eyebrows. Trying to remind myself that they have to fit within that shadow. I don't want them to feel like they're pasted on. I need to feel like they go from light into shadow. And they're wrapping around that form across the brow. And so the technique I'm using here with this overhand grip, I'm really just using the weight of the pencil. And in fact, there's actually a little bit of resistance up. So I have this overhand grip. These fingers are resting on the surface. It gives me a little bit of stability. And so there's a bit of an upward push from these fingers and then downward with these. So I can quickly modulate how much pressure I'm applying to the pencil. And it's this kind of modified grip where I have it kind of wedged in my fingers here and then rolling it over into this overhand. And again, that gives me just more control over that pressure while engaging the side of the pencil. All right. Oh, it would be, Ursula is saying it would be interesting to show the model art portraits. I'd love to be able to do that. I was able to do that with Britton, because he lives here, but... Oh, Zeffy is asking a question for y'all. Have you tried the Faber-Castell Pitt Graphite Matte Pencil? Supposed to be graphite, but cuts the graphite shine. I have not tried that, but I love the Faber-Castell charcoal, the Pitt charcoal. I love it. And so I should see if I can get my hands on some of that matte graphite. Because that is something I encounter here with the strong studio light that I've got. I get a bit of glare that can affect things. Okay, where am I going here? Again, holding off on finishing the eyes, but I'm going to set the stage a little bit by working on the eyebrows here, starting with this just kind of delicate touch. And again, I'm just using an overhand grip to build up some value rather than a hard line. That doesn't work. And that's the hard part of portrait drawing, is the slightest change to the eyebrow, the squint of the eyes, the turn of the mouth, changes the expression. And that's where I struggle with that quite a bit. Okay, so I'm going to move back into here. Actually, I think I need to bring out my blending stump to fill in some of the texture. Now, the mantra of this course is you're always contributing to the form. So when I have the blending stump, it's not just a way to smooth out the texture of the tooth of the paper. It's an opportunity to contribute to the form, so I'm trying to do that. And now, this is a well-used graphite pencil. I mean, graphite blending stump that is loaded with graphite. And so that helps me to make some marks. And I'm trying to be sensitive to the pressure, because if I bear down, it's going to really leave a mark on there. And I'm trying to observe where the soft transitions are going to be and be a little bit more delicate in those areas. And I can bear down a little bit more when I need a bit more value. Now, I'm also allowing the blending stump to kind of roll in my fingers as I'm building up the tone, because I wanted to evenly deposit and pick up graphite as I move through the drawing. I want to get that angle of that light right. And if you see blotches forming and you want a smooth transition to value, as you're building that up, try to target the light areas. Apply a little bit of pressure and then smooth it out. And then what I like about the blending stump is in these subtle areas in the light side, it's a little bit more gentle with regards to the tone that I'm applying to the page than the graphite itself. So if I want to, for example, really try to capture this subtle shadow here on the nose and then coming over the cheek, I can sneak up on it a little bit. It's not quite as harsh as it would be as if I were to use a just the graphite pencil. Now I need to, this is getting a little lost, a little disorganized here with the nose, so I'm going to have to wrangle that in a little bit. Now, one of the things that I've struggled with drawing noses is making edges that are too hard. It's a very soft edge. We often know, we recognize the bridge and there, you know, the long ridge of a nose, and we tend to want to make that sharper than it actually is. And so really look for how subtle and soft those transitions are. And if you can, try to, when you squint, try to identify where the shadow core is, the deepest part of the shadow, and try to find that path. All right, I think that I need to get that highlight in here. So bring out the eraser. So do a little bit of drawing there, and then I need to get that shadow shape established. I got a lot of work to do on that side. That's all right. But rather than labor on it, I need to step away from it. Move on to something else. In the background of my mind, I'm kind of chewing on that problem of the nose that I haven't really locked into the form. So that's kind of running in the back of my head, but I'm going to move on because sometimes there's information that you pick up in other parts of the drawing that can be useful and make everything else click, you know. So again, I'm treating the light side, those subtle variations in value, the form and the light side with the blending stump, because it's just a bit more gentle. Now I've lost that center of the mouth there, but it's all right. I'll get that back. There's definitely going to be some correction happening. This is the initial pass on the features that I'm going to need to kind of readdress. And part of it, what I'm reacting to is just I'm looking at it on at the vertical projection. I'm like, I didn't hit it, and I don't know how yet, but I'm trying to connect with that initial response to saying that that's not quite right. And now I feel like it's close. And if I squint, that can sometimes reveal some, you know, the next steps and how to make it work. But just kind of making a mental note that, you know, I'm getting closer. But that's part of the drawing process. Is that I really love is the problem solving. Right? Is now we get into the fight of the drawing, where I need to. There's going to be some struggle to try to get it to work. And it gets exciting. And I know there's been some battles that we've lost in this show. I've lost where drawing hasn't quite come together, but that's what's exciting. And I hope that I hope this one comes together. I feel like I had a good start, but as part of that ugly duckling stage that we've talked about before is when you feel like it's not going to come together. All right, so this, let me see. This is a great spot to use something like that DaVinci Eye app because, you know, it can help me to very quickly arrive at an understanding of what's wrong with my drawing. But I'm not going to use that today because I want there to be a certain amount of suffering today. I want to struggle. I want to struggle through this today. Some days I just don't want to struggle, and I use whatever tools I can to get there. That's all right. All right, I think I need to now, I feel my brain calibrating to the values here, kind of associating this dark with black. It's not as dark as I can get, so I need to kind of recontextualize that. Go a little bit darker in the shadow here and see what happens, and it's going to change the way I view some of these forms. So I'm going to look for the areas with the darkest darks generally in that shadow side. There's a darker value here. And I love the way this eyebrow reinforces the volume of the eyeball, right? There's just kind of formally, there's this really beautiful arch here that helps me to see that three-dimensional form of her eye nicely. All right, now there's that sharp shadow line here. And let me see what happens if I do some subtractive drawing and pull out some of that light there. Light is strongest on the inner portion of the eye here. Light is stronger here. So before I make any corrections to the features, I need to kind of make some corrections to the form, the light and shadow and the value range there. And then, yeah, there's this kind of lost the sense of light on this side. So doing some subtractive drawing, looking for the areas of the lightest light. And often you'll find them like, see that on the bridge of the nose where that sharp turn, either a concave or a convex point catches the light a bit more than other areas. So there's some delicacy required in here, but again, what I'm looking for is that form. I'll wipe that down to help kind of unify those highlights. I just kind of lost some of the brighter highlights that I just established, but that's all right. I find that generally I work better when I lay down a mark, take it down, lay it down again, take it down, and essentially do work on an area many times rather than labor on it in one go. All right, what do I need to do now? Oh, Ursula saying, I suffered enough at the dentist today. Sketch, welcome. Mad Mamas Go, thank you for that. Oh, Heather, you'll get there. There's a question here, Rob CP. Question please, Scott. If you were asked to draw a black and white portrait, how do you decide whether to use graphite or charcoal? That's a really good question. they're, how do I articulate this? Let me think. You know, of course, each medium has its own quality to it, and what I generally would recommend to people is to, you know, understand the unique characteristics of whatever medium you're working with, and then you try to extract as much power from that as you can. So, what are the unique strengths of charcoal? The range of value is, is greater with charcoal. You can just get richer dark, richer black values with charcoal than you can with graphite. Now with this Cezanne set that I'm working with, it comes with some really dark graphite and get pretty darn close. But graphite has a silvery quality to it. It has an opportunity for kind of greater delicacy. Now, you know, of course, you're going to find very delicate charcoal drawings. You're going to find really nice dark graphite drawings. You're going to find exceptions to all of those rules, but that generally becomes something that I factor into my choices is, you know, in this portrait, I'm intentionally creating a lighter, like a drawing that feels like it's more infused with light. And I wanted to use kind of that soft quality that graphite affords rather than that kind of the stronger contrast of the charcoal. Now that was really just driven by my feelings for today, and if I were to do this again tomorrow, I might choose to do it in charcoal, but it might affect the direction that I kind of nudge the portrait, if that makes sense. So there's, you know, the other factor to play into that, as I kind of alluded to, is just what type of experience do I want to have in the drawing process? Because that gets revealed in the product. Your drawing will show its process, and it's going to show and indicate something about you as the artist, how you were feeling that day, how you were reacting to the subject, and what was really interesting to you about the subject. And so the type of experience that I want out of the medium I'm using is a factor. If I want to be more precise and controlled, I tend to more graphite. If I want to be more expressive, I tend to charcoal more. But sometimes I just want to be precise with charcoal, and sometimes I want to be expressive with graphite. It's a hard one to answer, but hopefully that gave you some sort of understanding. All right, so what am I doing? Her eyes are really starting to bug me right now because I haven't resolved them. I think I need to do that. Even though I said earlier that I was going to hold off to the end, I can't, because it's affecting how I'm interpreting the rest of the portrait. So I have to pivot my direction a little bit. I think I've withheld that gratification long enough. And as I'm saying that, I just want to make sure that I'm in the right headspace with regards to value. I want to make sure I'm perceiving the value relationships properly. And I need darker value in here, in that shadow core. So I can get to that eye, because now that recontextualizes that dark mark there. And it was too flat before, so I'm hoping that now by darkening this side, it places these values more firmly in the light side of the head. Brenda, good comments there. Thank you, everybody. Good questions there. And as always, you know, how this is an open forum for any of you to answer too. You know, if you have different responses to what drives your decision with regards to medium, then I think that can be helpful. Okay, so again, it's one of those situations where my target is the eye, but in order to get there, I needed to give myself information in another part of the drawing. So that's where I had to kind of back away a little bit. Now I'm going to get into this eye. Whew, it's a tricky one. I want to make sure I thoroughly understand the shape of the eye. Now, the eyelids are often softer. These marks, they're often softer than we might initially view them as. So I'm kind of creating these fuzzy lines, leaving a little bit of space for the highlight there. And the same with that, the iris and the pupil, you know, they're all very soft marks. But I know, like, at least that's something that I have to fight, is that tendency to want to make a crisp line here, a crisp line there. But then when we do that, what I found is that it then ends up flattening out the form too much. Now I'm looking at trying to establish the structure of that lower eyelid, recognizing that there's a bit of a shelf that comes out and then down, and then we get this darker crease under here. And then light catches here again, where that turn is. This is really a light touch on the surface, and I want to use the tooth of the paper to help capture some of that skin texture. And now moving up into this upper eyelid. Now the eyes are can be particularly challenging because we start drawing eyes at such a young age, and we develop a symbol system for rendering eyes that often sticks with us. And then when we start to draw more formally, we're relying on that symbol system often too much. Like just the muscle memory of how to draw an eye. And so I'm really trying to my best right now to be aware of that. And again, keep that focus on understanding abstract shapes. And as I get into the shapes around the eye here, I'm trying to visualize them as sequences of short, straight marks rather than one continuous curve. In that way, hopefully that I'll arrive at a more precise sense of form in her eyeball. Now I can come back in here, really bear down a little bit, and go darker. And then where the sharp edge here is in the shine on the eye, that reflection. Everything else around there is going to be kind of a softer edge. And then try to remember that the eyeball is a ball, it's a sphere, so there's this larger shadow shape right in here that I can address to make sure that everything seems to fall into the shadow effectively and come out of the shadow effectively. And then there's a little bit of sharp light right in here. And then right in here I can pull out a little light in there. So I'm feeling happier now that with the expression now, having rendered the eye a little bit more. Cindy Winter, does the right side of the jawline face need to be narrower? The face seems too round. It definitely could. This right in here, I think you're absolutely right. Right now, it's just kind of a general mark that's going to need to be captured a little bit more. What's happened is that as I kind of wiped it down, I kind of lost that edge, and the ear is over here, and then that jawline actually comes in a little bit more on this side here. So everything got kind of merged in the blending of the forms. So, but thank you for pointing that out. And I'm going to move back to the eye, but there's a good chance I'm going to forget to come back to that. So let's see. Oh, and then Jane Jackson is saying, will there be a recording repeat of this? Yes, this will go up as a recording afterwards, so you can view all the old episodes. We're on episode 112 or 113, somewhere around there, and so they're all up as a recording on the playlist. And so this just gets added there. This link that you arrived on will take you to the recording. It sometimes takes a little while for the live chat to populate, so if that's something that you are interested in, viewing again, it might take a little while, but okay. Now moving on to this eye in here, again I'm going to soften it a little bit. I have just kind of a faint expression of the eye there. I'm going to sharpen up that shadow, and then that shadow gets sharp again here. In general, my approach to drawing eyes is to start from the outside in, kind of build from the form into the edges rather than starting from the eyelids and work my way out. Yes, the eyes are definitely not, in this portrait, there's a slight tilt to her head. And so I want to make sure that I capture the angle there. And then each eye, there's a general eye axis, but then each eye has kind of a unique subtle tilt to it. So it's a good observation there. My tree rings. Yeah, keep throwing those observations out. That's why we're drawing together. It's because you guys capture things that I miss. And now I have the larger reference image up here on my left. That's what I'm glancing to and kind of going back and forth. That allows me to get a little bit closer in on the eye. And again, because I had established the basic parameters, the placement of the eyes, I can be a little bit more free to explore the subtle details because I don't have to worry about them fitting in to the proportions as a whole. And one of the areas too that it always kind of trips me out a little bit are with the whites of the eyes, especially in the shadow side of an eyeball. So when we squint, this area here is all one kind of dark shape. But when I look closely, I can see a distinct difference between the iris and the white of the eye in that shadow side. So when you're looking at something, you're studying a specific area of your drawing and you squint at it, if those edges disappear, that's an indicator that the values are actually more closely aligned than you might be aware of. When we focus on something, it has a tendency to heighten the contrast beyond what is optically happening. So we actually see things with a lesser degree of accuracy. I don't know if that's the right word. We see things less accurately when we focus. When we focus on something that's designed to really understand kind of texture and kind of the nuanced proportions, those fine details, but it's not great for observing color and value. And so that's why it's really important to develop the skill of squinting and the indirect gaze, because it's when you combine your observations from squinting with sharp focus, that's when you come to really a comprehensive understanding of your subject. But it makes sense that we're often we start the drawing process with a mindset that we just need to look harder and look sharper, like really get in there, get a magnifying glass, but that our whole visual system kind of works against us, and when we do that, when we look with sharp focus, that is designed to extract just a certain type of information about the subject. When we have different set of information that we extract when we look indirectly. We have a different set of information when we look through blurred focus or out of our periphery. So it can be helpful to really practice that. I really love the way her eyelashes kind of fall into that shadow. And then she gets this little flick of light. Let me see if I can get this with this sharp eraser. And that's a little thing that doesn't really show up much, but it's worth a shot. All right, so now what I'm going to do is use my rubber eraser to kind of sculpt the form a little bit here. So as always, again, just like with the blending stump, the eraser is a correction tool, right? It's designed to remove material. But its greatest opportunity is in contributing to the form. So, think about the direction of your marks, the placement of them. How can you kind of model the form? All right, so that feels a lot better in terms of now capturing her expression, and because the facial features are all connected into a system. When one is off, it can throw off the other. So if I get the expression of the eyes incorrectly, then it might impact how I perceive the expression of the nose and the mouth. How are we doing on time? We're about an hour and a half in. I normally go about 2 hours, so we'll see if we wrap it up by then. All right, thank you everybody for the positive feedback. All right, now I'm going to move down to the nose here. And now one of the things that you might find helpful one of the things that comes to mind is feedback I would give students when we had a portrait assignment. And what I would say is to some students is to try to shift your thinking away from the features and into the space between the features. That can sometimes help. Again, our brains are designed to really pay attention to the facial features. That's why we often draw foreheads too small, because there's no information on the forehead really. It's very, very minimal. And so our brain just minimizes that and will often draw them too small. Whereas the eyes, we have a tendency to draw larger because that's something that's more critical to our understanding of the person that's in front of us. And so our brains kind of work against us in so many ways. So one way to override that is to intentionally shift your focus to the space between the features and see what information that gives you, and how that might impact how you interpret your subject. So if you're struggling with those proportions, that might be something you ask yourself is now when shifting to, when I shift my focus to the cheekbones, the upper lip here, the lower lip, the bridge of the nose, what does that tell me about the features themselves? So I switched to this tripod grip. It gives me a little bit more precision. But similar, I almost think about it as, now I'm just doing a lot of little drawings in one. Chuck Close is an artist that just passed away, but he was recognized for his work in portraiture, and he would create these portraits that might appear photorealistic from a distance, but as you get up closer, you realize that it's all thumbprints or small abstract paintings. That's something that he kind of fell into, repeated a lot when he was the idea of creating a portrait that is really a collection, an accumulation of all of these hundreds of small abstract paintings And I understand that to some degree because, and again, when we initiated the drawing, we're thinking about these large abstract shapes, these arrangements of light and dark. And now we're doing that same thing, we're keeping that same focus, but just on a smaller scale because I've worked out the proportions so I can isolate each area. And I know that they're all going to fit together. He was sure that his drawing would all hold together because he relied largely on grids and accurate proportions, and so it's just something I'd like to think about. And now, as I'm in this area, I'm observing reflected light, but before I start to lift any material to capture those subtle variations in value, I'm going to darken the areas around it and then evaluate if these light areas are actually light enough. Now and I mentioned that because that's another area where I would often give feedback on is that the reflected light would be overstated. And again, that's due to our brain's natural inclination to observe subtle variations in value. And when we observe them, we have the desire to make them more explicit than they might be optically. So in this way, now that reflected light is showing up here, I need to get that nostril now placed within it. I need it, and this is the other thing that now that I'm in that mode of focusing on fine detail, everything else falls away. That's the nature of focus, right? Is that you isolate the thing that you're putting your attention to and everything else disappears. And it really is hard to evaluate proportions when you're in that mode. So having your proportions defined ahead of time and worked out, and really understanding the context of the whole can allow you the freedom to then explore details with greater confidence. All right, so now I'm going to shift over to this nostril here. Now, again, one of the things that I'm trying to avoid is that symbol system that I feel being triggered in my brain right now to draw a nostril as like essentially an oval. And that's not the case here. Nostril isn't an oval. It's a sequence of straight marks and curves. It's a sharper edge here, a softer edge over here. And so again, kind of maintaining that thought process of looking for the abstract. Really delicate line in here. I just want to sharpen it up, but I don't want to darken it. So that gets really tricky sometimes. Holy smokes, Stevie 68A studied with Nelson Shanks. That's a big name in the portrait world. Holy smokes. Bet that was awesome. Yeah, I wouldn't consider myself a portrait artist. Again, this show is we're intentionally choosing subjects that help us grow in particular ways. My default is landscape, and so whenever we do a portrait, as the audience knows, I have to brace myself for the challenge, and I have an immense appreciation for portrait artists who have committed themselves to really understanding portraits and can do it with such ease, it seems. All right, so I found myself really absorbed in this area, so I need to step back and observe the whole to see, is it flattening out? Does it have a certain amount of depth? I feel like it's working out okay from a distance. I do feel the the anesthetic that the dentist gave me earlier starting to wear off. And I feel less comfort than I would like to at the moment, but it's not too bad right now. There's also this light here on the cheek that I'm going to resist lifting out. And I'm saying that, I think, to help keep myself accountable. Sometimes I talk to myself when I work. And what I tend to do is I like my initial impulse right now is to use the eraser to lift off that highlight. But I've just learned from past experience that I end up having to go back in and darken it again anyways. And I find it most effective to darken the areas around things first and then evaluate if I need to lift it. So if I darken this shadow core along in here, then I can look at that shape of light that's left and ask myself if I really need to lift it out or if I can just let it sit. So maybe I want to let it be. And Sue is saying, isn't her left eye less open? Maybe. It could be. Could be. Let me evaluate that. I'm gonna have to sit with that, and then reevaluate. But that's some good feedback there. In part because I know that I need to resolve all other parts of the drawing, and it might impact how I perceive that the eyes there. So kind of setting the stage, and then I don't doubt your observation. Yeah, it definitely, I feel like this eye is I've made too open, but I'm gonna let my brain chew on that for a little bit. All right. Now getting into the mouth, what am I looking at here? I have this kind of ghostly shape here that I can now refine. So again, I'm going to look for the shapes of light and shadow. There's this really interesting shadow cast by her upper lip here. And then we kind of quickly fall into the overall shadow shape here. So again, I'm gonna try to tackle this feature not by outlining it, but by carefully constructing the relationships between lighter and darker shapes, or darker and even darker shapes. Oh, and then Dita Van Stiprian, the hair comes on top, that changes the wide. Yeah, I've kind of lost some of the dimensions here as I've kind of smudged it. So that's something that I'm glad you brought that up too, because that's going to impact how we interpret the facial features. Oh, and then that is an interesting feedback. Maier is saying that, and we talk about that a lot in the show here. You know, as artists, we put ourselves in control of how and where we might deviate from the reference, right? And so I'm feeling more inclined today to try to be accurate when comparing myself to the reference. And so my kind of tolerance for variation might be a little bit lower today than it might be on some other day. But I need to kind of sit with that a little bit. You know, some days it's all about the expressive mark making, and sometimes a reference photo is just an origin for the work. But right now, to kind of get back to the here and the now, is to try to, as best I can, observe the overall shadow shapes here, and then try to carefully construct the lips from that shadow. Oh, this is really tricky here, because if you look here in the photo, that shape of that lower lip is really subtle. And I know there's part of me that's inventing marks that don't exist. Okay, so what I need to do, I've got this light forming here, and that's really the only landmark I can have. I can use to really place and define that side of the lip that's in the shadow. And actually, it's pretty close to placed correctly. This part's kind of blowing my mind right now. There's so much to pay attention to. The camera decided to glitch. There we go. Fix that. Let's see. I need to reorient myself. I'm sorry, I'm in the way of the camera here. And I did not get the tilt of her head, of her mouth correct. So if I look at that general axis here, you see how it tilts up to the right, when in the reference photo it tilts down to the right. And so that's where I can adjust a little bit. Let me just knock that whole thing out. And then move that point of light here that's catching on the corner of her mouth down a little bit. And I feel like that's a little bit better. Let me see. All right, there's some good conversation happening over here, and I'm getting absorbed into it, but I want to get back to the drawing. So I really like the back and forth that's happening, and I want to kind of get back to that. So I don't want to hold you up from sharing your thoughts about in particular the eyes. That we'll get to. Okay. And I'll notice here in the corner of the mouth, it really starts to tuck into shadow there. And then there's a kind of a harder edge here at the center of the mouth. And then we come up. And then right in here, there's a contrast between, there's a little ridge of light that catches in here, like bounce light in there. Again, before I lighten anything, I'm going to darken the area around it, because again, that's just my natural inclination, is to make things lighter in value, and I'm trying to override that. So in that way, it's very subtly indicating that shape of the lip, but I don't think I got that quite right. This shape in here gets darker, and these shadow shapes that kind of have an angle to them in here. How's that? I gotta kind of step back from it a little bit, and I just need to sharpen up. Sharpen up a little bit there. And then with these creases, really try to study the changing angles that help to suggest the form. So they kind of radiate out from the center, so they become more horizontal to the outer edges. Yeah, I don't feel like I captured the expression in her mouth accurately. But I know we're also running up on 2 hours, so I don't know how much I really want to get in and fix it. You know, it's all very subtle, and I think you'll end up just seeing me do the same things repeatedly. And there's light here. And there's light catching down here on the lip that comes across a little bit more on that side. But I'm generally happy with it. I think I'm close enough to kind of move on and maybe get back to you know, get back to other parts of the features. So I'm just kind of capturing the gap in the mouth, but what I'm looking for as I do this is variation, right? And so there's kind of like an interlocking of the upper and lower lips. They kind of fit together, kind of like this. And so there's a kind of a complex arrangement there, you know, between convex and concave lines that really make that line come together. It's not just one swoop. It's, you know, it's this interaction between convex and concave that that again makes it all come together. All right, and then I think I'm gonna maybe come back in here. I think I did make that eye a little bit too open on this part right in here. So it's a relatively simple fix just to straighten that out. And now, because you can see I've been picking up a lot of graphite on my hands, smudging this out. I've kind of lost any sort of definition on the form of her head, but where do I want to bring it into focus? Maybe right in here. I want to be selective about where I either drop a line or sharpen things up. And so as a result, I'm going to kind of move around I'm going to move around her head a little bit. You know, work on one area, move to another. And I'm evaluating, kind of moving my eyes quickly back and forth between the reference and the drawing to see what stands out. And the shape of the head, I'd really kind of pinched it in at the top and kind of let some of these edges get too soft. And then to see if there's an opportunity to create a little bit of variation in there. So just using the side of the pencil, I don't want this area to be in focus. I just want there to be enough information that we accept it and then move beyond it into the features. And then of also observing the hairline. That's one area that I would often talk to students about, is to really evaluate the edges along the hairline, because we have a tendency to overstate it. And I'm going to come back down here, reestablish the ear. It's in shadow mostly, so I can keep it fairly subtle, but I do want to have some of that in there. And in particular, I think I want to indicate that earlobe down there. And then I think I'll just be selective with the line work a little bit. Because I've been using the side of the pencil, it's kind of kept the point of the pencil fairly sharp. Here I want to intentionally create a contrast between an edge that's defined by value and an edge here that's defined by line, because that line is going to project forward. And then this edge here, that edge of the neck, is largely lost in the shadow. Just kind of a rough indicator of her shirt. And see how that comes together. But I think that's about it for today. I could keep working on it a little bit, but I think you've seen pretty much all I can throw at this portrait. I'm generally happy with it. A little bit nervous because, like I said, I did the preparatory drawing using an app that helped me to get those correct proportions, and I was worried if I'd be able to achieve them today. But you know, while I don't think I achieved 100% likeness, I'll call it a win. So next week, I'm gonna try something different. Greg, I think you're the one that mentioned maybe doing a two-parter, and that's what my plan is for the next 2 weeks. Is I found this a photo of an interior of an artist's studio that's just full of stuff. It's going to be all about complexity. How do we manage a complex subject like that? And we'll take a couple weeks to do that. So I need to be working on that a little bit, but it'll be a lot of fun, I think. It's a kind of a new subject. It'll be one that, again, that we haven't really done an interior, so that'll be new. And again, the focus will be on how to manage complexity. So hopefully you'll join us for that. And again, my intention is for it to be a two-parter, so that it gives us a week to kind of evaluate our drawing, kind of come up with a game plan, and then roll into the second week there. So yeah. Phew. Thank you, everybody. It's awesome to see new people. I know some of you have been watching for a while, first time participating in the chat, so I'm grateful that you did. I'm grateful that you joined us today. If you found us, hopefully you'll meet us again next Wednesday, again 3 p.m. Eastern. We meet every Wednesday. Check out artistnetwork.com. There's a link at the top of the chat, as well as in the description to the show page for this episode, where you can share your work if you've been drawing along. And if you want to share a different portrait altogether, that's fine. I have some of you that post digital work or painting. Again, this is all about us just kind of getting together and draw. There's no curriculum, there's no requirements, as long as it's respectful and in some way ties to the theme. And if you have another drawing that you want to share, we have episode pages for all 112 previous episodes. So feel free to share on those as well. So thank you so much again. It's been awesome. I think we got to all the questions. I really appreciate all the back and forth, all the feedback, some really good observations that I always appreciate. So have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.